There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a room at the end of a long day, and if you are hearing this now in the dark with the lights already off, then you already know it. Settle in, pull the blanket a little higher. Tonight we are going somewhere small and strange and surprisingly tender a place. Most histories never bother to visit because it lives in the space between a person's hip and their hand, in a fold of cloth so ordinary that almost nobody has ever stopped to ask where it came from or who was allowed to have one. Here is what is at stake tonight, stated plainly the way these things deserve to be stated. For most of human history, having somewhere safe to carry your own belongings was not a given. It was not built into your clothing the way it is built into yours right now. It had to be fought for, sewn in by hand, hidden from thieves, and in the case of half the population, it was eventually taken away entirely on purpose by people who decided that a woman's hand should be occupied by something other than her own possessions. Tonight is the story of that fight told slowly the way it actually happened. But before we widen the lens, let me bring you close to one person, because that is always where the real story begins. In the autumn of the year 1991-2, hikers crossing a high mountain pass on the border between Austria and Italy came across something they first assumed was a piece of rubbish or perhaps the remains of a lost climber from recent decades. It was neither. What they had found was a man who had died more than 5,000 years earlier, preserved almost perfectly by the ice that had covered him within hours of his death, and uncovered again only because a warm season had briefly melted the glacier down to where his body lay. Researchers would later name him Ötzi, after the mountains in which he was found. He had been struck by an arrow and had bled to death alone on that ridge sometime in the final years of a life spent as a hunter, a herder, perhaps a fugitive from some conflict we will never fully understand. And when they examined his clothing layer by careful layer, they found something almost startling in its familiarity. Tied to his belt was a small leather pouch, and inside it, wrapped and ready, were the tools he had judged worth keeping closest to his body in what may have been the last hours of his life. A scraper, a drill, a flake of flint sharp enough to cut, a little dried fungus likely carried for its usefulness in starting a fire, or perhaps for something closer to medicine. A man alone on a mountain, 5,000 years before any of us were born, had solved the same small problem that you solved this morning without thinking about it at all. Where do I put the things I cannot afford to lose? It is a strange thing to realize that the solution he found, a pouch tied at the waist, sewn shut and trusted, would still be recognizable to us today. And it is stranger still to learn how differently that simple solution would be treated, depending on who was wearing it. Because what almost nobody tells you is that the pocket as we understand it now, sewn quietly into the seam of a garment and taken completely for granted, is a remarkably recent invention, and one that unfolded very differently for men and for women. Scholars still debate exactly when the first true pocket hidden inside the fabric itself, rather than tied on top of it, appeared in Europe. What the evidence does suggest is that for a very long stretch of history, everyone, regardless of who they were, carried their most essential belongings the same way Ötzi did, in a bag knotted to a length of rope or a leather belt worn openly on top of their clothing. And then, sometime around the 15th and 16th centuries, something begins to shift. The pouch starts disappearing, not because it stops being useful, but because it starts being hidden, tucked inside the folds of a garment for safety, and that single quiet decision to conceal rather than display sets off a chain of consequences that will eventually decide for centuries afterward whose hands are trusted to carry their own belongings freely and whose are not. Before we go further into that story, I want to ask you for something small and only once, because it genuinely helps more than you might think. If this is the kind of history you've been looking for, the kind told slowly, honestly, without the noise, take a moment now to subscribe and leave a like. It costs you nothing, and it tells me you would like more nights like this one. And if you have a moment, I would love to know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and what it was about this particular story that made you stop scrolling and stay. I read every one of them, even the short ones, especially the short ones. Now get comfortable because we have a long way to go together and none of it needs to be rushed. So let us go back further than Ötzi, further than any pouch or pocket that has ever survived to be studied, to the plain practical problem that every human being who has ever worn clothing has had to solve in one way or another. You are walking somewhere, you are carrying something, you need a tool, a coin, a bit of food, something small enough to fit in a closed hand, but too important to simply hold the entire way. Your hands, after all, are needed for other things, for climbing, for defending yourself, for carrying a child, for working. And so the question becomes almost unavoidable, one that has followed our species since long before anyone thought to write it down. Where does a person keep the things they cannot afford to drop or lose or have taken from them? For thousands of years, the answer was almost universally the same. No matter where in the world you happened to live, no matter your wealth or your standing, you tied it to your body. A cord around the waist, a strip of leather, a knotted piece of cloth, and from it hanging visibly against your hip or your thigh, a small bag holding whatever mattered most. It was not hidden, it was not shameful, it was simply how a person carried their life with them out in the open, the way we might now casually carry a set of keys in a hand or a phone tucked against a leg. And in the world that follows Ötzi, the world of the medieval centuries that stretch across Europe from roughly the 11th century onward, this remains true for men and women alike. Both tie small pouches to their belts. Both fill them with the same kinds of ordinary essential things, a few coins, a whetstone, perhaps a small knife, the scattered tools of daily survival in a world with no drawers, no cabinets, no safe place to leave anything behind while you travelled. It is in its own quiet way one of the last long stretches of history where the simple right to carry your own belongings belongs equally to everyone who needs it. That equality, as gently as it began, will not last. Somewhere ahead of us in the crowded, glittering streets of a growing medieval city, someone is about to notice that a visible pouch hanging open and unguarded from a stranger's belt is also an invitation. And the moment that realization spreads, the story of the pocket and of who gets to keep one begins to change in ways that will echo for the next 500 years. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a room at the end of a long day, and if you are hearing this now in the dark with the lights already off, then you already know it. Settle in, pull the blanket a little higher. Tonight we are going somewhere small and strange and surprisingly tender a place. Most histories never bother to visit because it lives in the space between a person's hip and their hand, in a fold of cloth so ordinary that almost nobody has ever stopped to ask where it came from or who was allowed to have one. Here is what is at stake tonight, stated plainly the way these things deserve to be stated. For most of human history, having somewhere safe to carry your own belongings was not a given. It was not built into your clothing the way it is built into yours right now. It had to be fought for, sewn in by hand, hidden from thieves, and in the case of half the population, it was eventually taken away entirely on purpose by people who decided that a woman's hand should be occupied by something other than her own possessions. Tonight is the story of that fight told slowly the way it actually happened. But before we widen the lens, let me bring you close to one person, because that is always where the real story begins. In the autumn of the year 1991-2, hikers crossing a high mountain pass on the border between Austria and Italy came across something they first assumed was a piece of rubbish or perhaps the remains of a lost climber from recent decades. It was neither. What they had found was a man who had died more than 5,000 years earlier, preserved almost perfectly by the ice that had covered him within hours of his death, and uncovered again only because a warm season had briefly melted the glacier down to where his body lay. Researchers would later name him Ötzi, after the mountains in which he was found. He had been struck by an arrow and had bled to death alone on that ridge sometime in the final years of a life spent as a hunter, a herder, perhaps a fugitive from some conflict we will never fully understand. And when they examined his clothing layer by careful layer, they found something almost startling in its familiarity. Tied to his belt was a small leather pouch, and inside it, wrapped and ready, were the tools he had judged worth keeping closest to his body in what may have been the last hours of his life. A scraper, a drill, a flake of flint sharp enough to cut, a little dried fungus likely carried for its usefulness in starting a fire, or perhaps for something closer to medicine. A man alone on a mountain, 5,000 years before any of us were born, had solved the same small problem that you solved this morning without thinking about it at all. Where do I put the things I cannot afford to lose? It is a strange thing to realize that the solution he found, a pouch tied at the waist, sewn shut and trusted, would still be recognizable to us today. And it is stranger still to learn how differently that simple solution would be treated, depending on who was wearing it. Because what almost nobody tells you is that the pocket as we understand it now, sewn quietly into the seam of a garment and taken completely for granted, is a remarkably recent invention, and one that unfolded very differently for men and for women. Scholars still debate exactly when the first true pocket hidden inside the fabric itself, rather than tied on top of it, appeared in Europe. What the evidence does suggest is that for a very long stretch of history, everyone, regardless of who they were, carried their most essential belongings the same way Ötzi did, in a bag knotted to a length of rope or a leather belt worn openly on top of their clothing. And then, sometime around the 15th and 16th centuries, something begins to shift. The pouch starts disappearing, not because it stops being useful, but because it starts being hidden, tucked inside the folds of a garment for safety, and that single quiet decision to conceal rather than display sets off a chain of consequences that will eventually decide for centuries afterward whose hands are trusted to carry their own belongings freely and whose are not. Before we go further into that story, I want to ask you for something small and only once, because it genuinely helps more than you might think. If this is the kind of history you've been looking for, the kind told slowly, honestly, without the noise, take a moment now to subscribe and leave a like. It costs you nothing, and it tells me you would like more nights like this one. And if you have a moment, I would love to know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and what it was about this particular story that made you stop scrolling and stay. I read every one of them, even the short ones, especially the short ones. Now get comfortable, because we have a long way to go together and none of it needs to be rushed. So let us go back further than Ötzi, further than any pouch or pocket that has ever survived to be studied, to the plain practical problem that every human being who has ever worn clothing has had to solve in one way or another. You are walking somewhere, you are carrying something, you need a tool, a coin, a bit of food, something small enough to fit in a closed hand, but too important to simply hold the entire way. Your hands, after all, are needed for other things, for climbing, for defending yourself, for carrying a child, for working. And so the question becomes almost unavoidable, one that has followed our species since long before anyone thought to write it down. Where does a person keep the things they cannot afford to drop or lose or have taken from them? For thousands of years, the answer was almost universally the same. No matter where in the world you happened to live, no matter your wealth or your standing, you tied it to your body. A cord around the waist, a strip of leather, a knotted piece of cloth, and from it hanging visibly against your hip or your thigh, a small bag holding whatever mattered most. It was not hidden. It was not shameful. It was simply how a person carried their life with them out in the open, the way we might now casually carry a set of keys in a hand or a phone tucked against a leg. And in the world that follows Ötzi, the world of the medieval centuries that stretch across Europe from roughly the 11th century onward, this remains true for men and women alike. Both tie small pouches to their belts. Both fill them with the same kinds of ordinary essential things, a few coins, a whetstone, perhaps a small knife, the scattered tools of daily survival in a world with no drawers, no cabinets, no safe place to leave anything behind while you travelled. It is in its own quiet way one of the last long stretches of history where the simple right to carry your own belongings belongs equally to everyone who needs it. That equality, as gently as it began, will not last. Somewhere ahead of us in the crowded, glittering streets of a growing medieval city, someone is about to notice that a visible pouch hanging open and unguarded from a stranger's belt is also an invitation. And the moment that realization spreads, the story of the pocket and of who gets to keep one begins to change in ways that will echo for the next 500 years. The story of the pocket, like most quiet revolutions in the way ordinary people live, does not announce itself. It simply accumulates garment by garment, decade by decade, until one day the world looks different than it used to, and nobody can quite say when the change actually happened. And by the time we arrive at the 15th century, standing at the edge of what historians call the early modern period, the accumulation has produced something remarkable, an era when the hidden pocket, once a narrow, practical slit cut into a plain tunic, blossoms into something far richer, far more elaborate, and briefly, wonderfully shared almost equally between men and women. To understand why, you have to understand what has happened to clothing itself in the 2 centuries since those first fitchets appeared. Fabric has become more abundant across Europe. Trade routes stretching from Florence to Bruges to London carry wool, silk, and dyed cloth in quantities earlier centuries could not have imagined. And as fabric becomes more available, garments themselves grow larger, fuller, more deliberately voluminous. Sleeves widen into great hanging folds. Skirts gather into layers upon layers of gathered cloth. Doublets and gowns alike are cut with room to spare, not out of carelessness, but as a quiet, visible display of wealth. A person who can afford to waste this much fabric on drapery and gathering is a person announcing without saying a word that they have more than enough. And it is inside this newly generous, newly voluminous clothing that the hidden pocket finally finds room to become something ambitious. Historian Rebecca Unsworth, who has studied surviving garments and household records from this period in unusual depth, has argued that pockets become genuinely visible in the historical record from the late 15th century onward, growing steadily more common through the entire 16th century that follows. This does not mean pockets were invented in this period, not exactly. The tie-on pouch, the fitchet slit, all of that groundwork had already been laid centuries earlier. What changes now is scale and ambition, and a kind of quiet normalization. Where a pocket had once been a narrow accommodation tucked discreetly into an otherwise plain garment, it now becomes a deliberately constructed feature sewn directly into the lining of a skirt. A doublet, a gown sized generously enough to hold a genuinely useful collection of belongings, and concealed so completely within the fullness of the fabric that a person could carry it through a crowded street without the faintest visible bulge to give it away. Picture for a moment what this actually looked like on an ordinary body in an ordinary year, say somewhere in the 1500s in a market town, not so different from the one we stood in earlier tonight. A woman moving through her day is not simply wearing a pocket the way we might casually think of a modern trouser pocket, small, flat, and afterthought. Hers is closer to a separate pouch entirely sewn from sturdy linen or wool, sometimes decorated with careful embroidery that would never be seen by anyone but herself, and inserted into her skirts through a discreet slit opening. Much like the fitchets of centuries before, except now the pouch itself is a fixed, sewn part of the garment rather than something tied on and removable. Inside it she might carry coins certainly, but also keys to a household chest, a small prayer book, a folded letter, a thimble, perhaps a bit of dried herb carried for its scent or its supposed medicinal use. Her entire small private world moving with her invisible beneath layers of gathered fabric exactly where she alone can reach it. And here is the detail that tends to surprise people most, the one easy to lose entirely beneath 5 centuries of everything that happens afterward. During this particular window of history, men carry these same kinds of hidden pockets, two sewn into their doublets and breeches in very similar fashion, filled with very similar things. The division that most people now take for granted. The assumption that pockets have always been somehow more naturally a masculine feature of clothing simply does not hold true here. For roughly a century and a half, hidden pockets belong to whoever has a voluminous enough garment to conceal one within, regardless of whether that garment happens to be a doublet or a gown. It's worth sitting with that for a moment because it complicates a story that often gets told far too simply. The popular version of pocket history likes a clean villain and a clean turning point, some single moment when someone decided women should no longer be trusted with their own storage. The actual history, as it usually does, resists that kind of tidiness. What the evidence increasingly suggests is that pockets flourished for both sexes precisely because both sexes were, for a brief stretch of history, wearing clothing generous enough to hide them properly. The real fracture, the one that will eventually separate men's pockets from women's so completely that most people alive today assume the divide was always there, has not happened yet. It is still ahead of us, and when it arrives, it will not come from any single dramatic decision. It will come, as we will see, from something as seemingly unremarkable as the changing cut of a coat. The evidence supporting all of this, it should be said honestly, comes with real limits. Surviving garments from this period are rare, and the ones that do survive tend to belong disproportionately to wealthier households whose clothing was more likely to be preserved, inherited, or recorded in written wills. Scholars still debate exactly how far this practice of hidden sewn-in pocketing extended down through the social classes. Whether a labouring woman in a small village had access to the same kind of tailored pocket as a merchant's wife in a growing city, or whether she continued relying on the older, simpler tie-on pouch out of necessity. What survives in the written record Will's household inventories, the occasional court case involving stolen goods, gives historians glimpses, rather than a complete picture fragments from which the larger pattern has to be carefully, honestly reconstructed rather than simply read off in full. But even with those limits acknowledged, one thing comes through with real clarity, and it is perhaps the quiet, overlooked heart of this entire part of the story. For a window of roughly a century and a half stretching from the late 1400s through much of the 1600s, the hidden pocket represents something close to equality, an equal architecture of privacy sewn into the clothing of men and women alike, offering each of them the same small, protected space to carry the same essential pieces of a private life. It is not a perfect equality, of course. Almost nothing in this era is. Wealth still determines who has access to fine tailoring at all, and the objects a woman carries in her pocket keys to a household she manages rather than owns a prayer book, reflecting a faith she was rarely permitted to interpret for herself, still tell you a great deal about the narrower world she otherwise moved through. But within the specific, small question this story is asking tonight, who gets to have somewhere private to keep their own belongings? The answer for this particular century and a half is almost startlingly close to everyone who can afford a proper garment at all. There is something quietly moving in imagining these two pockets, a man's and a woman's, sewn into their separate garments, using very nearly the same technique, filled with very nearly the same kinds of small essential things, existing side by side in the same households, the same streets, the same crowded market mornings we keep returning to throughout this story. It is easy, looking back from where we stand now centuries later, to assume that inequality in dress has always simply been the natural order of things, waiting patiently in the background of every century to reassert itself. This particular stretch of history quietly argues otherwise. For a while at least, the pocket belonged to whoever needed one and needed the fabric to hide it in. That will not last. Fashion, as it always does, is already beginning to shift again beneath the surface of this golden hidden age, and the very fullness of dress that has made such generous equal pocketing possible is about to start narrowing, tightening, reshaping itself in the ways that will eventually pull this brief equality apart thread by thread. Not everywhere at once and not for everyone at the same time, but somewhere ahead of us, in the tailoring shops and fitting rooms of a changing century, a decision is quietly being made about whose clothing gets to keep its fullness and whose does not, and that decision is going to matter far more than anyone making it could possibly have realized. History rarely moves in straight lines, and nowhere is that more true than in the story of clothing, where a single change in fashion seemingly trivial can quietly rearrange the lives of millions of people who never asked for it. So it goes with hose. By the middle of the 1500s, a striking new silhouette has taken hold among fashionable men across much of Europe, particularly in Italy, where a great deal of the era's most influential tailoring originates. Hose, the fitted leg coverings men had worn for generations, grow tighter, closer, more deliberately form-fitting than anything worn before. The Venetian engraver Cesare Vecellio, observing the young men of his own city, would later describe hose cuts so close to the body that a man's muscles seemed almost entirely visible beneath the fabric, as though he were wearing hardly anything at all. It is a striking image and a telling one because it points to something easy to overlook. Fashion in this period is not simply decorative. It is a language, and what it is saying loudly is that a wealthy young man's body is worth displaying rather than concealing. But displayed a clothing stretched taut and close against the skin has a very particular problem. There is nowhere left to hide anything. This is the quiet tension sitting underneath the golden equal age of pocketing we spent the last stretch of our evening exploring. Fullness had made concealment possible, and fullness for men at least is now beginning to disappear from fashionable dress, replaced by a narrower, closer silhouette that leaves almost no room for the generous hidden pouches sewn into looser doublets only a few decades earlier. A fashionable man of this period dressed in tightly fitted hose has almost nowhere left on his own body to keep so much as a coin without it being visible, or worse, entirely absent, tucked instead into a servant's bag or a saddle, or simply left behind. It's worth pausing here, because this is exactly the kind of detail that tends to surprise people who assume men's fashion has always prioritized practicality over appearance. It has not. For a stretch of the 16th century, some of the most fashionable men in Europe are, in a very literal sense, walking around with nowhere to put anything, all in service of a silhouette meant to be admired rather than used. Something has to give, and what gives gradually over the better part of the following century is the garment itself. Through the 1600s, men's fashion begins a long, slow migration away from tight hose and toward looser, longer coats. Waistcoats and breeches garments with room once again for something to be hidden inside them. And this time when pockets return, they do not return as separate tie-on pouches accessed through a discreet slit the way they had been for centuries. They return sewn directly into the garment itself, a fixed, permanent, built-in feature of the coat or the waistcoat or the breeches, no different in principle from a sleeve or a collar. By the final decades of the 17th century, a well-made coat for a gentleman is expected to include pockets as a matter of course positioned at the hip, sometimes at the chest cut generously enough to carry a folded letter, a small purse of coins, eventually a pocket watch, once that particular invention becomes fashionable enough to be worth carrying at all. This is the moment worth sitting with tonight because it marks something genuinely new in the long story we have been following. For the first time, the pocket stops being an accessory, something added to an outfit, tied on, removable, optional. It becomes architecture, a permanent structural part of what a respectable man's clothing simply is expected by tailors, assumed by wearers, no more remarkable to mention than a button or a cuff. And once something becomes architecture rather than accessory, it becomes very difficult to take away. The evidence for exactly how quickly this shift spread across different countries and different classes of men remains admittedly somewhat uneven. Surviving tailoring records and pattern books from the period give historians a reasonably clear picture of fashionable dress among the wealthy, whose garments were more likely to be documented, preserved, or passed down. What remains less certain is how quickly and how completely sewn-in pockets reached the coats of labouring men tradesmen, farmers, the vast majority of the population whose clothing rarely survives in museum collections or aristocratic portraits. What the record does suggest fairly consistently is that by the early 1700s, the sewn pocket has become close to universal in men's outerwear across a wide range of social classes, spreading downward from fashionable courts into the everyday coats worn by ordinary working men, carried along by tailors who had simply learned that a coat without pockets was, by this point, an unfinished coat. There is something almost touching in imagining what this small architectural shift actually meant to the men who lived through it, even if none of them would have described it in such grand terms. A pocket sewn permanently into a coat meant a man could move through his entire day, however long and unpredictable it turned out to be, without needing to think twice about where his money was or his letters or the small tools of whatever trade kept him occupied. His hands stayed free, his possessions stayed close, and crucially, nobody could take that particular freedom away from him without also taking the coat off his back entirely. Why, though, did this same architectural shift not extend so completely into women's clothing during these same decades? It is a fair question and an important one to sit with honestly before we go any further tonight, because the easy answer that women's fashion simply had no room for pockets the way men's briefly did during the era of tight hose does not actually hold up particularly well under close examination. Women's gowns throughout this same period remain, for the most part, considerably fuller than men's increasingly tailored coats gathered into skirts with more than enough hidden volume to conceal a sewn-in pocket just as generously as any doublet from the century before had done. The physical obstacle that briefly interrupted men's pocketing simply does not exist in the same form for women during these decades. And yet the sewn permanent pocket migrating so smoothly into men's coats and waistcoats and breeches does not make that same migration into women's dress. The old tie-on pouch worn beneath the skirt and accessed through a slit in the fabric persists instead, unchanged in its basic form exactly as it had been for the better part of 2 centuries already. Scholars still debate why this particular divergence takes hold when it does, and the honest answer is that no single explanation fully accounts for it. Some point to differences in how men's and women's garments were constructed and tailored during this period, women's dress often assembled from separate looser pieces, rather than the more fitted seamed construction of men's coats, making a permanently stitched pocket a somewhat more awkward technical fit. Others point towards something less about fabric and more about who was and was not expected to move independently through the world, carrying money documents and the tools of a public trade. Both explanations likely hold a piece of the truth, and neither one on its own is quite sufficient. What is clear watching this moment unfold from a comfortable distance of several centuries is that something has begun to split quietly, almost invisibly, between the two halves of this story we've been following since a frozen mountainside and a small leather pouch. Men's pockets are becoming permanent, structural, assumed. Women's pockets remain exactly what they have always been, separate, removable, tied on and hidden beneath layers of skirt that nobody but the wearer herself will ever see. It is not yet a dramatic divide. Nobody living through these decades would have described it as any kind of turning point at all, but small divergences left long enough have a way of becoming enormous ones, and this particular divergence is only just beginning to make itself felt. Every family, if it lasts long enough, develops its own quiet inheritance, and in many households across 17th and 18th century England, That inheritance included a pair of pockets literally so stitched by hand, sometimes passed down from a mother to a daughter along with whatever small fortune they happened to hold. To understand what a woman's pocket actually looked like during this period, it helps to set aside the word itself for a moment because it means something quite different than it does today. A woman's pocket in this era was not a slit sewn into the side seam of a skirt. It was an object in its own right, a flattened teardrop-shaped bag, usually made of sturdy linen, sometimes finished with careful embroidery. Roped through with a length of tape or ribbon long enough to tie comfortably around the waist. Most women wore not one, but two of these pockets, one on each hip, tied together by that same waist tape worn underneath the outer gown and petticoat, entirely invisible to anyone standing in front of her. To reach inside, she needed only to find the discreet opening left in the side seam of her skirt, called a placket, and slip her hand through into a pocket that existed in a kind of private architecture entirely separate from the clothing draped over top of it. It is worth sitting with how strange and how sensible this arrangement really was. A woman's pocket did not belong to any single gown. It belonged to her. When she changed clothes for the evening, she did not need to transfer her belongings from one garment to another, the way we might move a wallet from one coat to the next today. She simply retied the same familiar pocket around her waist beneath whatever she happened to be wearing that day, and carried on exactly as before. In a very real sense, her pocket was the one piece of her wardrobe that never changed steady and constant beneath every outfit she owned, holding whatever she judged important enough to keep close. And what did women actually keep inside them? Here the historical record becomes unexpectedly rich, mostly for a reason that says something quietly troubling about the world these women lived in. Because pockets were tied on rather than sewn in, and because they hung beneath the skirt rather than within it, they could be snatched entirely, cord and all, by a practiced thief working a crowded street or a busy market. When that happened, and it happened often enough to leave a substantial paper trail, the case sometimes ended up recorded in a court of law, and the victim was asked under oath to describe exactly what had been taken from her. Those court records, preserved in remarkable detail in cities like London, give historians something rare, an itemized first-hand account of what an ordinary working woman considered worth carrying through her day. Coin certainly, but also keys to a trunk or a cupboard, a thimble, a folded letter from a relative, a small knife, spectacles, a handkerchief, occasionally a modest piece of jewellery too valuable to leave at home and too precious to risk losing. One case preserved from London describes a stolen pocket containing, among other things, a pair of scissors, a nutmeg grater and 11 shillings in coin, an oddly specific little inventory that somehow says more about a single ordinary life than 100 formal portraits ever could. It is a strange gift in its way that theft gave to history. Without the crime, we might never have known precisely what filled these hidden pockets, because the pockets themselves, unlike a fine gown or a formal portrait, were never meant to be seen, admired, or remembered. They existed entirely for their owner's private use, and it is largely through the misfortune of having them stolen that we come to know what an ordinary woman's private life actually contained. This vulnerability to theft, in fact, gives the English language one of its more enduring phrases. As pocket-tied women moved through crowded streets, their pockets, though hidden beneath layers of skirt, remained a known and predictable target for those skilled enough to reach them, whether by slitting the placket opening wider with a hidden blade, or by working a hand in carefully enough to lift the entire pocket free of its tie. The practice earns its own term during this period. Pocket picking, later shortened simply to picking pockets, a phrase that has long since outlived the specific tie-on pockets that first gave it meaning, and now describes an act that, strictly speaking, no longer involves anything resembling the pocket that originally coined it. There is something worth pausing on here. a small contradiction sitting quietly at the center of this entire arrangement. The tie-on pocket was designed in part as a private protected space hidden beneath the skirt, specifically to keep a woman's belongings safe from prying eyes and grasping hands. And yet its very concealment, its position beneath layers of fabric rather than sewn firmly into a seam, made it in some ways more vulnerable than the fixed pockets increasingly sewn into men's coats during these same decades. A man's pocket stitched permanently into the lining of his coat could not be lifted away whole. A woman's pocket tied on with nothing sturdier than a length of tape sometimes could cord and contents together, gone in a single deft motion. The very design meant to offer protection carried within it a particular fragility that the newer, structural pockets migrating into men's clothing simply did not share. Why, one might reasonably ask, did this vulnerable separate arrangement persist for women for so long, decade after decade, while men's clothing moved steadily toward permanent sewn-in pockets during these same years? The honest answer is that historians do not have a single tidy explanation, and the evidence that survives allows for more than one reasonable reading. Some point to the practical matter of construction. Women's gowns during much of this period were still assembled somewhat differently than men's increasingly tailored coats built from separate bodice and skirt pieces, rather than a single continuous seamed garment, which may have made a permanently integrated pocket a more awkward technical fit than simply continuing the older tie-on tradition. Others suggest something closer to habit and custom, the sheer inertia of an object that had worked perfectly well for generations, worn by mothers and grandmothers alike with little obvious pressure from within these households to change it. What the evidence does not support, interestingly, is the idea that women's fashion during this period was too narrow or too fitted to conceal a pocket the way men's tight hose briefly had been centuries earlier. Full skirts, petticoats, and the layered gowns of this era offered more than enough hidden volume. The obstacle, whatever it truly was, does not appear to have been purely a matter of available space. What these tie-on pockets do reveal quite movingly is a small but genuine dimension of personal identity expressed entirely in private for an audience of exactly one, because pockets were rarely seen by anyone other than their owner. The embroidery, the careful stitching, the small decorative touches many women added to their own pockets served no public purpose whatsoever. Nobody at the market, nobody at church, nobody passing on the street would ever glimpse the careful floral pattern a woman had spent evening hours working into the linen of her own pocket. It existed purely for her, a small hidden act of care and craftsmanship folded into an object nobody else would ever see. Surviving examples in museum textile collections today show remarkable variation, some plain and clearly functional, others worked with initials, dates, even small personal mottos stitched quietly into the fabric, evidence that even the most private unseen object in a woman's wardrobe could still carry something of who she was. Scholars still debate how consistently this practice extended across different levels of society. The embroidered, carefully preserved pockets that survive in museum collections today disproportionately represent wealthier households whose textiles were more likely to be kept passed down and eventually donated or catalogued. What a labouring woman's pocket typically looked like, whether it carried the same careful decoration or served a purely utilitarian purpose with no embellishment at all, remains harder to reconstruct with confidence pieced together, mostly from more scattered evidence, incidental mentions in wills, occasional glimpses in genre paintings depicting market women and servants going about ordinary daily tasks. What does emerge clearly across every level of society? These records allow us to glimpse is a picture of remarkable stability for roughly 2 centuries stretching from the 1600s. Well into the 1700s, the tie-on pocket remains essentially unchanged in its basic form, a quiet constant in a world otherwise reshaping itself around new fashions, new fabrics, new silhouettes arriving from Paris and London and Vienna in an increasingly rapid, restless cycle. Fashion changes the shape of the gown worn over top of it again and again during these decades. It does not, for a remarkably long time, touch the simple practical object hidden beneath. That stability, as steady and dependable as it seems from where we sit tonight, is nearing its final years. Because somewhere ahead of us, waiting at the very edge of the 18th century, a new silhouette is beginning to take shape in the fashion houses of Paris, one built on an entirely different set of values than the full-gathered gowns that had sheltered women's pockets for so long. It draws its inspiration not from the elaborate courts of the recent past, but from something older and thinner and far less forgiving of anything hidden beneath the fabric. And when it finally arrives in full, it will not simply reshape what women wear. It will take from them almost entirely the one private personal space their clothing had quietly protected for nearly 200 years. The 18th century, for all its powdered wigs and formal manners, ends in upheaval, and fashion, as it so often does, follows revolution far more closely than most people realize. By the 1780s, a quiet unease has begun spreading through the fashionable circles of Paris, a growing discomfort with the elaborate structured silhouette that had defined women's dress for generations. The wide panniers, the heavy brocades, the towering powdered hair, all of it starts to feel to a certain restless class of trendsetters, less like elegance and more like excess, a visible symbol of a court increasingly out of step with a changing world. And when the French Revolution arrives in 1789, sweeping away far more than fashion, it also sweeps away almost as an afterthought the entire architecture of dress that had sheltered women's tie-on pockets for the better part of 2 centuries. What replaces it is something genuinely new and genuinely radical, though it rarely gets remembered in those terms today. Inspired by a romanticized vision of ancient Greece and Rome, fashionable French women begin adopting a style of dress that looks almost nothing like anything worn in living memory. Gone are the wide skirts, the structured stays, the heavy layered fabric. In their place comes a long, straight, high-waisted gown cut from thin, pale muslin, gathered simply beneath the bust and left to fall in soft, close folds all the way to the ankle. Historians now call this the neoclassical silhouette, or sometimes the Empire style, and it spreads with remarkable speed from Paris outward across Europe and before long across the Atlantic to America as well. It is worth pausing on the fabric itself because it explains almost everything that follows. Muslin, the cotton favoured for these new gowns, is prized precisely for how little of it there is. It is thin, nearly translucent, in good light, so light and close-fitting that fashionable women of the period sometimes dampen the fabric slightly before wearing it just to make it cling even more closely to the body beneath, echoing the sculpted drapery of classical statues they so admired. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most physically revealing silhouettes fashionable Western dress had embraced in centuries. And here quietly but unmistakably is where our long story reaches its turning point. Because a pocket, however small, however cleverly sewn, creates a bulge. And a gown built from the thinnest, most clinging fabric available, designed specifically to reveal, rather than conceal the shape of the body beneath it, has absolutely nowhere left to hide one. Think back for a moment to everything we have followed together across this evening. The generous gathered dresses of the 16th century with room enough to hide an entire sewn pocket without the faintest visible trace. The full petticoats of the 17th and 18th centuries layered thick enough to conceal not one but 2 tie-on pockets tied at the waist, swinging gently and invisibly beneath every step. For nearly 300 years, the sheer volume of women's clothing had done double duty, expressing wealth and fashion on the surface while quietly sheltering an entire private world underneath. Neoclassical fashion breaks that arrangement completely, not through any deliberate decision about pockets specifically, but simply because the two things, a sheer clinging silhouette and a bulky hidden pocket, cannot physically coexist. Faced with this sudden, unglamorous problem, Fashionable women turned to a small drawstring bag carried openly now rather than hidden beneath the skirt worn looped over the wrist or hung from a ribbon at the waist. Historians and costume scholars refer to it today by its period name, the reticule, a word borrowed from the Latin for a small net or bag. It holds at best a fraction of what the old tie-on pocket once carried: a few coins, perhaps a folded handkerchief, a small vial of scent, little more. And it is crucially visible to everyone hanging openly from the wrist rather than tucked safely beneath layers of fabric the way pockets had been for centuries. The reaction to this new little bag, and this is one of those details that tends to genuinely surprise people, was not entirely warm. Contemporary wits and satirists of the period took to mocking the reticule almost as soon as it appeared, playing on its resemblance to the word ridicule, and the nickname stuck widely enough that some sources from the period actually refer to the bag using that mocking term rather than its proper name. It is a small telling detail, easy to miss but worth sitting with. The very object meant to replace centuries of practical hidden storage was from its earliest days treated by at least some observers as something faintly absurd and an inadequate little substitute for what had quietly been lost. Was this loss noticed at the time, one might reasonably wonder, or did it simply arrive gradually enough that nobody quite registered what was slipping away? The honest answer, based on what survives in letters, journals and satirical prints from the period, is a little of both. Some contemporary voices did comment, sometimes with genuine irritation, on how impractical the new fashions had become, complaining that a woman could no longer carry her own money, her own keys, her own small necessities without either risking an unsightly bulge beneath her thin muslin gown or relegating everything to a small bag, easily snatched, misplaced, or simply too small to hold what she actually needed. Other voices caught up in the genuine excitement of a fresh, dramatically different fashion, after decades of increasingly rigid formal dress, seemed to have barely noticed the trade being made at all, distracted by how strikingly modern and liberating the new style felt after the heavy stays and wide panniers of their mother's generation. There is a real and uncomfortable irony sitting at the centre of this moment, one worth naming plainly rather than smoothing over. The neoclassical silhouette was embraced by many of the women who first adopted it precisely because it felt like a kind of liberation, freedom from tight stays, from heavy layered fabric, from a rigid formal way of dressing that had constrained an entire generation of women before them. And yet this same liberating fashion, in freeing women's bodies from one kind of physical restriction, simultaneously stripped away one of the few pieces of genuine practical independence their clothing had quietly offered for nearly 2 centuries: the ability to carry their own belongings privately and securely without depending on anyone else to hold store or manage them. Scholars who study the history of dress still debate how consciously any of this was understood at the time, and the evidence honestly does not allow for a fully confident answer either way. It is entirely possible, even likely, that no single tailor, no single fashionable woman in Paris ever sat down and deliberately decided that women should lose their pockets as the price of a fashionable new silhouette. What seems more probable, based on the scattered evidence that survives, is something quieter and in some ways more unsettling: a gradual, almost accidental drift driven by fabric and silhouette rather than any conscious decision about who deserved practical storage and who did not. The consequence either way lands the same. By the turn of the 19th century, the sewn or tied pocket that had quietly served women for the better part of 200 years has all but vanished from fashionable dress, replaced by a small, decorative bag that satisfies none of the same practical needs, and that tellingly nobody ever seemed to mock when it came to men's coats, because men's pockets sewn permanently into the architecture of their tailored garments were never put in this position to begin with. That asymmetry, quiet as it seems from where we sit tonight, is the real turning point in this long story, more than any single gown or any single Parisian salon. men's clothing having already made its pockets structural and permanent by the end of the 17th century simply continues on, largely undisturbed as fashion shifts and reshapes itself around them. Women's clothing having relied for centuries on a separate tied-on solution rather than a built-in one, proves suddenly and completely vulnerable the moment fashion changes its mind about how much fabric a body is allowed to wear. It is not that anyone set out deliberately to build a system fragile enough to collapse this easily. It is simply that nobody had ever bothered to make it sturdy in the first place, and fragility once exposed rarely announces itself gently. What comes next as the new century settles in, and this thin, revealing silhouette gives way in time to new fashions again, is not a simple return to what came before. The tie-on pocket, once so ordinary that generations of women barely thought twice about tying it on each morning, does not simply reappear once fuller skirts eventually return to fashion. Something has shifted quietly but permanently in how women's clothing relates to the question of carrying one's own belongings, and untangling exactly what has been lost and what it will come to cost the women living through the century that follows is where our story turns next. Fashion has a peculiar way of circling back on itself, offering with one hand what it had taken away with the other, and rarely admitting the debt it owes to what came before. By the 1840s and 50s, the thin, clinging muslin gowns of the neoclassical years have long since fallen out of favour, replaced by something almost their exact opposite. Skirts balloon outward again wider than anything worn since the previous century, held aloft first by layers of stiffened petticoats and later by an ingenious cage of flexible steel hoops known as the crinoline. A fashionable woman walking down a street in 1858 might be wearing a skirt 6 feet across at the hem, a genuinely enormous quantity of fabric surrounding her on every side. You might reasonably expect, given everything we have followed together this evening, that all this returning fullness would bring the pocket back with it, tucked once again into the generous folds of skirt the way it had been for centuries before the neoclassical interruption. And in a narrow technical sense it does. Small pockets do reappear sewn discreetly into the seams of some Victorian skirts. But something essential has changed in the decades since the reticule first appeared, and it does not simply reverse itself. The pocket that returns is a shadow of what was lost, small, shallow, often little more than a token gesture toward practicality, rather than a genuine solution to it. The habits, the fashions, and increasingly the expectations that had grown up around the some small handheld bag during the neoclassical decades do not disappear just because the silhouette around them has changed again. A respectable Victorian woman is now expected to carry a separate bag as a matter of course, regardless of how much fabric happens to be billowing around her legs at any given moment. Into this gap between what fashion promised and what it actually provided. Victorian women develop something genuinely inventive, an accessory that deserves far more attention than it usually receives. It is called the chatelaine, named after the mistress of a great house who traditionally carried the household's keys, and in its Victorian form it becomes a kind of portable toolkit worn openly at the waist, a decorative clasp from which hang a small collection of chains, each one ending in a useful object suited to a woman's daily responsibilities. Scissors, a thimble case, a small notebook and pencil, keys to the household's various locked cupboards and drawers. Sometimes a tiny vinaigrette bottle meant to hold smelling salts for the genuinely common Victorian affliction of fainting in overly tight stays. Worn by housekeepers and fashionable ladies alike, though in rather different forms depending on one's station, the chatelaine represents something quietly telling about this whole period, a willingness to solve the problem of carrying one's belongings through almost any method except the one solution that would have been simplest all along, a properly sized pocket sewn directly into the dress itself. Why, one might fairly wonder, did something as straightforward as a larger, more practical pocket remain so persistently out of reach for Victorian women, even as skirts grew wide enough to easily accommodate one? The most honest answer historians can offer is that by this point the absence of adequate pockets in women's fashion had become something closer to convention than to genuine necessity, a habit so deeply embedded in how tailors and dressmakers approached women's clothing that it rarely occurred to anyone involved to question it. Fashion, once a pattern, takes hold firmly enough does not require a continuing practical justification to persist. It simply continues generation after generation until someone decides, often for reasons that have very little to do with fabric or fashion at all, to ask why. That questioning arrives when it finally does from a rather unexpected direction, tangled up with one of the great social movements of the 19th century. In the early 1850s, a small circle of American women, including the writer and social reformer Amelia Bloomer, begin publicly advocating for a radically different style of dress, one that abandons the heavy restrictive layers of conventional Victorian fashion in favour of a shorter skirt, worn over loose gathered trousers, an outfit that quickly becomes known somewhat mockingly at first by Bloomer's own name. The Bloomer costume, as it comes to be called, provokes an extraordinary amount of public commentary, much of it hostile, some of it openly ridiculing, filling newspaper columns and satirical illustrations across both America and Britain for several years running. What is easy to miss, buried beneath all that noise and mockery, is what these women were actually arguing underneath the specific question of trousers and hemlines. They were arguing at root that a woman's clothing should serve her body and her life, rather than the other way around, that comfort, movement and practicality deserved to matter as much for women's dress as they had always mattered for men's. The Bloomer costume itself does not last as everyday fashion, largely defeated by the sheer weight of public ridicule rather than by any genuine practical failing. But the underlying argument it represents does not disappear along with it. It resurfaces more formally organised decades later in 1881, when a group in London founds an organisation called the Rational Dress Society, dedicated explicitly to opposing what its members considered the most physically harmful and impractical excesses of fashionable Victorian dress: tightly laced corsets, excessively heavy skirts, and yes, quite specifically, the persistent absence of genuinely functional pockets. The Society's own publications from this period make the connection explicit in ways that feel remarkably direct even today, arguing that women's dependence on small, easily lost handbags rather than secure pockets built into their own clothing was not merely an inconvenience but a real practical limitation on how freely and independently a woman could move through her own day. It is worth sitting with how significant this shift in framing actually is. For nearly a century, the absence of proper pockets in women's fashion had largely been treated, when it was noticed at all, as a matter of style, a quirk of changing silhouettes, mildly inconvenient perhaps, but not especially consequential. The Rational Dress Society and the broader movement it belonged to begins reframing that same absence as something closer to a question of autonomy, an argument that would only grow louder and more explicitly political as the century drew toward its close, and the fight for women's suffrage gathered its own considerable momentum alongside it. The evidence connecting dress reform directly to the broader suffrage movement remains, it should be said honestly, somewhat tangled, and scholars still debate precisely how much overlap existed between the two causes at any given moment, since not every suffragist embraced dress reform and not every dress reformer identified as a suffragist. What does emerge clearly enough from letters, pamphlets, and organisational records surviving from this period is that the two movements shared a great deal of the same underlying argument, however differently each one chose to express it. Both in their own particular way were asking the same essential question: what does a woman's body and a woman's clothing actually need to allow if she is expected to move freely through public life, to work, to travel, to organise, to carry her own money and her own papers without depending on someone else to hold them for her. It is a strange thing looking back from where we sit tonight to realize that a conversation beginning with something as small and ordinary as a sewn pocket eventually finds its way into some of the great political arguments of an entire century. But history, more often than the tidy version usually suggests, tends to work exactly this way. Small, unglamorous, everyday frustrations accumulating quietly for generations until they finally surface as something learned enough and organized enough for the wider world to finally have to listen. What remains as the 19th century closes and gives way to the 20th is a question still very much unresolved. One that the Rational Dress Society and its allies had raised with real clarity, but had not by the century's end managed to fully answer. Fashion was beginning ever so slightly to shift in response to their arguments, but old habits of tailoring old assumptions about what a woman's clothing was meant to hold and to show do not simply dissolve because a persuasive case has finally been made against them. Somewhere ahead of us in the century, now just beginning, that unresolved question is about to collide with new fabrics, new freedoms, and a fashion industry increasingly organized around ideas that would have startled even the most outspoken members of the Rational Dress Society, ideas about who pockets were really for and who quite deliberately they were not. What survives of any vanished way of life is almost always a matter of accident rather than intention. And the story of the woman's pocket is no exception. Nobody in the 1700s set out to preserve these small hidden objects for future study. They were considered too ordinary, too personal, too easily replaced to be worth deliberately saving. And yet scattered across museum collections, family attics and old parish records, a genuinely remarkable body of evidence has quietly survived anyway, offering us something rare, a direct physical connection to lives otherwise almost entirely undocumented. Consider for a moment how few of these tied-on pockets actually remain today. Textile historians who have surveyed major collections across Britain and North America estimate that only a few hundred examples of the 18th century tie-on pocket survive worldwide in any recognizable condition, held mostly in institutions like the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, and a scattering of smaller regional collections. A few hundred out of what must have been millions upon millions of these objects made worn, mended, and eventually discarded across 2 centuries of ordinary daily life. It is a strikingly small number, and it says something quietly important about whose belongings history tends to keep. Fine gowns, worn perhaps a handful of times for special occasions, survive in far greater numbers, carefully folded away and treasured precisely because they were too valuable, too rarely worn to wear out. A pocket, by contrast, was used every single day for years, sometimes for an entire adult lifetime, and objects used that constantly and that intimately rarely survive their own usefulness. This is in its own way the first piece of evidence worth sitting with tonight, not what survives but what the very scarcity of survival tells us. The pocket was not a precious object set aside and protected. It was a working tool worn against the body through decades of ordinary labour, mended again and again as the fabric wore thin, and eventually, when it could no longer be repaired, simply discarded or repurposed into something else entirely. The most telling evidence, in other words, is written in what did not survive nearly as clearly as in what did. Among the pockets that do survive close physical examination reveals a great deal that written records alone could never tell us. Textile conservators studying these surviving objects have found layer upon layer of careful mending patches of fabric sewn in to reinforce worn seams, small tears stitched closed, with thread that sometimes does not quite match the original fabric, evidence of a garment kept in use far longer than its original maker likely intended. One well-documented pocket held in a British collection shows at least 3 distinct phases of repair work spanning What conservators estimate to be well over a decade of continuous use patched and repatched by its owner, rather than replaced a small quiet testament to how much a single object could mean to the person who depended on it daily. The written record, meanwhile, offers a different but equally valuable kind of evidence, one that takes us beyond the object itself and into the world of the women who owned them. Wills and probate inventories from the 17th and 18th centuries occasionally list pockets explicitly among a woman's possessions bequeathed by name to a daughter, a sister, a close friend, sometimes described in enough detail that historians can identify exactly what kind of fabric or decoration the pocket featured. This detail matters more than it might first appear. A pocket was rarely an object of significant monetary value, certainly nothing compared to jewellery, fine linens, or household furniture, also commonly listed in these same documents, that a woman would nonetheless think to name her pocket specifically in a will, passing it deliberately to a particular person, rather than simply lumping it into a general category of clothing, suggests something closer to sentimental weight than practical necessity. An object that had come to represent something more personal than its modest material value alone would explain. Then there is the evidence that arrives somewhat uncomfortably through crime, evidence we touched on briefly earlier this evening, but which deserves a closer look now that we are examining the historical record more directly. The Old Bailey Courthouse in London, which handled criminal trials for the city and its surrounding areas for centuries, maintained unusually detailed written records of the cases brought before it, and a significant number of those surviving records concern the theft of women's pockets snatched from their owners in crowded streets, markets, and churches, because English law of this period required prosecutors to establish the precise value of stolen goods. In order to determine the severity of the resulting charge, victims were often questioned in remarkable, almost forensic detail about exactly what their stolen pocket had contained. The resulting testimony, preserved in the court's own written records and still accessible to researchers today, gives historians something genuinely rare: sworn, itemized inventories of ordinary women's most private possessions, recorded not because anyone thought to document women's lives deliberately, but purely as an incidental byproduct of the legal process, built to punish the men and women who stole from them. What no single piece of evidence can fully settle, and what scholars studying this period still genuinely debate, is how representative these surviving pockets and court records actually are of women's experience more broadly across different regions and different levels of society. The pockets that survive in museum collections today disproportionately belong to women wealthy enough to own finely embroidered examples worth preserving by their descendants. The court cases that survive disproportionately concern urban theft in cities large enough to maintain detailed judicial records, London chief among them. What a working farm woman in a small rural village typically carried, and how she typically lost it if she ever did, remains far harder to reconstruct with any real confidence, pieced together from scattered, incomplete fragments rather than any comprehensive source. The historical record, in other words, gives us a genuinely vivid picture of some women's pockets and only shadows and guesses regarding many others. There is one further category of evidence worth mentioning tonight, quieter than court records, but in some ways more moving, found not in museums or legal archives, but in genre paintings and prints produced throughout this period, casual scenes of everyday life. Market women, servants, labourers, painted or engraved, not as formal portraits, but simply as background figures in a busier composition. Art historians examining these images closely have found repeated, incidental depictions of women reaching through the placket opening of their skirts, accessing a pocket beneath, captured almost accidentally by artists who are not trying to document pocket history at all, simply trying to depict an ordinary moment of daily life with enough accuracy that a contemporary viewer would recognize it instantly. These images offer something the written record cannot, a visual confirmation of exactly how the gesture looked in practice, how naturally and unself-consciously it must have been performed by women who had been doing it since childhood. Taken together, this scattered, imperfect body of evidence, a few hundred surviving textile objects, a handful of wills, a body of court testimony born from crime rather than curiosity, and a scattering of incidental images allows historians to reconstruct a picture of the tie-on pocket that is genuinely rich in some respects and frustratingly incomplete in others. We know with real confidence what these objects look like, how they were constructed, and a great deal about what specific women carried inside specific examples on specific days when misfortune struck. We know considerably less about the full ordinary texture of daily use across the broader population, the years upon years of unremarkable mornings when nothing was stolen, nothing needed recording, and a woman simply tied on her pocket reached for what she needed throughout an entirely uneventful day and thought nothing more of it at all. It's worth sitting for a moment with how much of history depends on exactly this kind of accident, objects preserved, not because anyone understood their future value, but because a family happened not to throw them away, or because a crime happened to bring them before a court that happened to keep detailed records. Most of what these women carried, most of the small private worlds they held close against their bodies, every single day for most of their adult lives has simply vanished, the way most ordinary things eventually do. What remains is enough to glimpse the shape of what was lost, though never quite enough to see it whole. And it is precisely because the evidence remains this fragmentary that historians studying this period have not always agreed on how to interpret what does survive, nor on the deeper reasons behind the patterns the evidence does reveal. That disagreement, reasoned and genuine rather than merely academic, is where our attention turns next. Historians rarely agree completely on anything, and the question of why women's pockets disappeared so thoroughly from fashionable dress turns out to be one of the more genuinely contested corners of this entire story argued over, not because the basic facts are in dispute, but because the facts alone do not fully explain themselves. Consider the shape of what we actually know laid out plainly. Women's pockets existed sewn or tied for centuries, shared on roughly equal terms with men's. Then within the space of a few decades, around the turn of the 19th century, they largely vanished from fashionable use, replaced by a small handheld bag, widely mocked as inadequate even by the people who carried it. The men who study this transition professionally do not disagree about any of that. What they disagree about, sometimes quite pointedly, is why it happened and what that why reveals about the century that allowed it. One school of thought, and it is worth taking seriously precisely because it resists the more dramatic explanation many people reach for instinctively, treats the disappearance of women's pockets as essentially an accident of fashion, a side effect of the neoclassical silhouette rather than any deliberate choice about who deserved practical storage. Textile historian Barbara Berman, whose research into pocket history remains among the most thorough available, has argued that the story is fundamentally one of changing garment construction. Thin muslin simply cannot conceal a bulky pocket, the way heavy wool and layered petticoats once could, and once fashion moved in that direction for reasons having nothing to do with pockets at all. Women's strayed became collateral damage in a much larger shift toward a different aesthetic ideal. On this reading, nobody sat in a room and decided women should carry less. Fashion simply changed shape, and pockets, as a purely practical matter, could no longer fit inside it. A second line of interpretation pushes back against reading this as pure accident and asks a harder question underneath the fabric itself. Why, after all, did fashion move in a direction that so specifically stripped women of practical independence, while men's fashion, during these same decades, moved the opposite way toward permanent structural pockets built directly into every respectable coat? Historians were working from this angle. including scholars associated with the broader field of dress and gender studies, point out that the loss was not evenly distributed by accident. It fell entirely on one sex at precisely the moment that sex was also facing intensifying social expectations around dependence, decorum, and visibility. A woman of this period increasingly needed a male relative, a husband, a father, a brother, to manage her formal financial affairs in the first place. Is it truly a coincidence, this argument asks, that her clothing simultaneously stopped offering her a private, secure place to carry money and documents of her own? Scholars still debate how much weight this argument can bear, since intention is notoriously difficult to prove from clothing alone, and no surviving document from the period explicitly states any such motive. But the pattern itself, whatever produced it, undeniably lines up with a broader set of constraints tightening around women's independence during these same decades. A third, somewhat less examined explanation looks not at fashion or gender directly, but at commerce, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives. The small handbag that replaced the pocket did not simply appear out of thin air. It had to be made, sold, and marketed by milliners, haberdashers, and eventually the earliest department stores, beginning to take shape across major European and American cities through the 1800s. A pocket, sewn into a dress by its owner or a household seamstress, generates no separate transaction, no additional purchase, no repeat business. A handbag, by contrast, is a standalone product, one that wears out, goes out of fashion, and needs replacing far more often than the sturdy linen pockets women had once made to last for years, sometimes decades. Some historians of consumer culture have suggested cautiously that the shift from pocket to handbag also tracks the broader rise of a consumer economy, increasingly organized around selling women fashionable accessories as a category unto itself, an economic incentive running quietly alongside and perhaps reinforcing whatever purely aesthetic or social forces were also at work. This explanation, it should be said honestly, remains the most speculative of the three, harder to prove directly than the more straightforward evidence of changing silhouettes, and most scholars treat it as a contributing thread rather than a primary cause. What makes this particular historical debate genuinely difficult to resolve rather than simply unresolved through lack of trying is that all three explanations can be true simultaneously without actually contradicting one another. Fashion did shift toward a thinner silhouette for reasons connected to Revolution classical revival and changing ideals of the body, reasons that had nothing directly to do with gender politics or commerce. That same shift did happen to fall exclusively on women, at a moment when other forms of dependence were also tightening around them, whether or not any single tailor intended that outcome. And a growing consumer economy did stand ready and eager to profit from whatever gap the changing fashion left behind, regardless of what had originally caused it. History, more often than the tidiest textbook account admits, tends to work through exactly this kind of tangled convergence, several separate currents flowing together toward the same shore, none of them requiring a single deliberate architect to produce a genuinely consequential result. There is a smaller, quieter thread of debate worth mentioning too, because it complicates the picture in an interesting direction. Some historians examining working-class and rural women's dress during the very decades when fashionable women were losing their pockets have found evidence that practical tie-on pockets persisted considerably longer among women who could not afford or had no use for the latest Parisian silhouette. A farm labourer or a market seller, whose daily work required carrying tools, coins and produce, regardless of what fashion plates in London or Paris happened to be showing, that season had far less reason to abandon a working pocket for a decorative bag that could not actually hold what her day required. This suggests something worth sitting with, that the disappearance of the pocket, whatever ultimately caused it, was in some real sense a fashionable phenomenon before it became a universal one. trickling down through the social classes at an uneven pace, only gradually becoming the default assumption across the wider population as the 19th century wore on. None of these competing explanations, it is worth saying, plainly cancel each other out, and none of them on their own fully accounts for everything the evidence shows. What they offer instead, taken together, is something closer to the genuine complexity of how a society actually changes, not through one clear decision made in one clear moment, but through fashion, economics, and deepening social expectation all moving in roughly the same direction at once, each one reinforcing the others until the outcome comes to feel to everyone living inside it less like a choice than simply the way things are. And it is that last quiet phrase, the way things are, that carries the most weight of everything we have considered together tonight. Because once a limitation stops looking like a specific traceable decision and starts looking instead like an ordinary unremarkable feature of the world, it becomes far harder to question and far easier to simply inherit generation after generation without anyone quite remembering there was ever a different way. That inheritance, and what it actually cost the women who lived inside it, is where our attention turns as this long night continues. The word consequence tends to summon images of something sudden, a single dramatic event followed immediately by its fallout. But the true consequences of the vanished pocket unfold far more slowly than that, seeping quietly into the practical texture of ordinary women's lives across an entire century, rarely announced, rarely even named, as connected to something as small as a missing seam of fabric. Begin with something as basic as money itself, and how a woman of the 1800s was actually permitted to hold it. Under English common law throughout most of this century, a legal doctrine known as coverture meant that a married woman's property in the vast majority of cases legally belonged to her husband, the moment she married, not merely in some abstract financial sense, but down to the coins she might otherwise have carried in her own pocket. This is worth sitting with carefully, because it reveals something the fashion history alone cannot fully show. The disappearance of the practical pocket did not happen in isolation from the law. It happened alongside a legal system that for much of the century gave a married woman remarkably little of her own money to carry in the first place. A pocket, however generous, cannot hold what its owner is not legally permitted to possess. The two forms of dependence, one stitched into fabric, one written into statute, reinforced each other quietly for decades, each making the other feel a little more natural, a little more unremarkable than it might have seemed standing alone. That legal landscape does begin shifting as the century wears on, gradually and unevenly through a series of reforms, always collectively known as the Married Women's Property Acts, passed in England in stages, across 1870 and 1882, granting married women for the first time in generations clear legal rights to earn, hold and control their own money and property independently of their husbands. It is genuinely striking, looking at the timeline honestly, how closely this slow legal unwinding of financial dependence tracks alongside the slow parallel argument being made by dress reformers over that same span of decades, the Rational Dress Society, founded barely a year after the Second Property Act passed. Scholars still debate how directly connected these two threads truly were in the minds of the women pushing for change, whether campaigners saw the sewn pocket and the legal right to hold money as genuinely linked causes, or whether the timing is closer to coincidence, two separate movements responding to the same broader shift in how Victorian society was beginning, however reluctantly, to imagine women's independence. What is not in dispute is that both changes were in their own way addressing the same underlying question, whether a woman was entitled to hold and manage something as basic as her own money without needing to route it through a man first. The consequences reach further than money alone, touching something even more immediate, the simple physical experience of moving through a working day. Consider the domestic servant, one of the single largest categories of employed women in Victorian Britain, whose daily labor required her to carry keys, coins for household errands, small tools and notes between rooms and floors of a large house dozens of times over the course of an ordinary shift. Household manuals and domestic advice literature from this period occasionally address the problem, directly recommending that servants be provided with a small, sturdy pocket sewn into an apron or a plain working dress, precisely because the decorative reticules and small handbags fashionable among the mistresses of these same households were simply unworkable for anyone expected to use both hands constantly throughout a demanding physical job. It is a small telling detail easy to overlook. Practical pockets never fully vanished from women's lives during this period. They persisted quite deliberately, exactly where actual physical labor made the fashionable alternative genuinely unworkable, while fashionable women, whose days required less constant physical use of their hands, were the ones left carrying the burden of the small impractical bag. This divide between labouring women who retained something closer to a functional pocket and fashionable women who did not becomes considerably more pronounced and considerably more consequential as the century approaches its final decades and a new kind of working woman begins entering public life in genuinely unprecedented numbers. The growth of large offices, department stores and telegraph exchanges through the 1870s and 1880s creates, for the first time at real scale, a category of respectable unmarried women working outside the home in clerical and retail roles, women who needed to carry papers, coin for fares, keys to a rented room while moving briskly and independently through crowded city streets in a way earlier generations of fashionable women with their households of servants managing so much of daily errand running for them had simply never needed to do in the same way. The small handbag, adequate perhaps for an evening at the theatre, proves clumsy and genuinely limiting for a woman walking briskly to catch a train before her shift begins. Tailors and dressmakers serving this new practical clientele begin responding gradually and unevenly with jackets and tailored walking suits that once again incorporate genuine functional pockets not hidden beneath layers of skirt in the old 18th century manner, but sewn directly into the jacket itself, echoing, whether consciously or not, the structural solution men's tailoring had settled on nearly 2 centuries earlier. There is a particular irony worth pausing on here, one that threads back through nearly everything we have followed together this evening. It is not sentiment or persuasive argument alone that finally begins restoring something like a genuine pocket to fashionable women's clothing by the century's end. It is necessity, the plain practical demands of paid work performed outside a household that had once managed so many of these small logistical needs on a woman's behalf. The women entering offices and shops in the 1880s and 90s were not, for the most part, campaigning explicitly for pockets the way the rational dress society had. They simply needed somewhere to put their things in order to do their jobs, and tailors, ever responsive to what paying customers actually required, began quietly supplying it. A parallel and in some ways even more vivid chapter of this same story unfolds around an entirely different kind of movement through the 1890s, the sudden enormous popularity of the bicycle among fashionable women across Britain, Europe and America. Cycling required an entirely new category of women's clothing, one that could not accommodate the trailing skirts and constricting stays of conventional Victorian fashion without genuine physical danger. Skirts catching in wheel spokes had caused documented accidents and even fatalities. The resulting cycling costumes, featuring shorter divided skirts or occasionally the same loose trousers Amelia Bloomer had championed decades earlier, to widespread ridicule, almost always included practical functional pockets sewn in specifically to hold house keys, coin for repairs, and the small tools a cyclist might genuinely need if a chain slipped or a tyre punctured miles from home. Contemporary writers of the period, including suffragist Susan B. Anthony, who famously credited the bicycle with doing more for women's independence than any other single invention of the era, were describing something that extended well beyond transportation alone. A woman on a bicycle dressed in a costume built for genuine physical activity, rather than decorative display, moved through public space with a kind of self-sufficient mobility pockets included. That fashionable Victorian dress had denied her for the better part of a century. None of this arrived without resistance, and it is worth being honest about how contested even these practical functional pockets remained throughout this period. Newspaper columns and etiquette manuals from the 1890s frequently mocked cycling costumes and their pockets as unfeminine, occasionally suggesting that a woman who needed somewhere practical to carry her own belongings while moving through public space had in some vague, unstated way forfeited a portion of her proper femininity in the process. The argument stripped down to its bones is remarkably similar to the one satirists had aimed at the reticule a full century earlier, only inverted. Where the reticule had once been mocked as inadequate, the functional pocket was now in certain quarters mocked as inappropriate evidence of how thoroughly the absence of practical storage had become tangled up across an entire century with ideas about what a properly feminine woman was and was not supposed to need. What emerges by the very end of the 19th century then is not a clean, triumphant return of the pocket, but something messier and more genuinely human. A slow, uneven, often contested reclaiming driven, far less by any single argument winning decisively than by the accumulated practical pressure of women's lives themselves changing in ways that made the old absence increasingly undeniably unworkable. The servant's apron pocket, the office worker's tailored jacket, the cyclist's practical, sometimes ridiculed divided skirt. Each one in its own narrow context quietly re-establishing something that fashionable dress had spent an entire century trying to convince women they did not particularly need. It would be satisfying to end this part of the story there on that note of gradual, hard-won restoration. But the truth, as it usually does, resists such a tidy resolution, because even as these practical pockets crept back into working women's clothing through the century's final decades, they returned smaller generally than their male equivalents, tucked into the specific garments suited to specific kinds of labor, rather than built as a universal, assumed feature of women's clothing the way pockets had long since become for men. The gap that had opened quietly back in those 17th century tailoring shops and widened so dramatically during the neoclassical years was narrowing by the century's end, but it had not closed, and the shape it had taken across these 100 years of separate, unequal development would carry forward largely unresolved into the century that followed. Waiting to resurface in forms none of these Victorian reformers could have quite imagined in the tailored trousers of a working woman decades hence, and eventually in the small telling pair of blue jeans. 2 world wars separated by barely 20 years would do more to reshape what women were permitted to wear than a full century of petitions and reform societies had managed on their own, and they would do it not through argument but through sheer urgent necessity. When the First World War draws millions of men out of factories, offices and fields across Britain, France and eventually the United States, the women who step into those vacated jobs step almost immediately into vacated clothing as well, or something close enough to it. Munitions workers, land girls tending farms, once worked by absent men, women driving ambulances and operating heavy machinery. All of them find quickly and unavoidably that the narrow, decorative dress of the pre-war years simply cannot survive contact with actual industrial labour. Trousers, overalls and heavy jackets, once considered scandalous or at best eccentric when worn by women, become almost overnight standard working attire across factories on both sides of the Atlantic. And trousers, unlike the fashionable skirts they replace, come with pockets built in as a matter of course, inherited directly from the same masculine tailoring tradition that had made pockets structural and permanent in men's clothing 2 centuries earlier. It would be satisfying to say this wartime shift settled the matter permanently, but history characteristically offers something messier. When the war ends and men return to reclaim their former jobs, a great deal of this practical clothing is quietly set aside as well, fashion reverting for a time toward more conventional lines. What does not fully reverse, though, is something harder to measure than hemlines or trouser seams: a shift in expectation, a growing sense among an entire generation of women who had worn functional clothing and done demanding physical work that the old decorative helplessness of Victorian fashion no longer described who they actually were or wanted to be. The 1920s translate that shift into one of the more striking silhouettes of the entire century: the loose, straight, boyish dropped waist, popularized by designers including Coco Chanel, whose own path to prominence had begun tellingly by designing practical, comfortable clothing inspired partly by menswear itself. Chanel's early designs, drawing openly on the ease and functionality of men's jackets and sportswear, brought patch pockets and structured seaming into fashionable women's wardrobes with a confidence the rational dress society, mocked so thoroughly only decades before, could scarcely have imagined achieving in their own era. What had once been derided as unfeminine now became in Chanel's hands the very definition of modern sophistication. Then comes the Second World War, and with it a second wave of the same pattern deepened and made permanent in ways the First War had not quite managed. Women again enter factories in overwhelming numbers, the popular image of the female rivy to sleeves rolled, wearing sturdy pocketed coveralls becoming one of the defining visual symbols of the entire wartime home front on both sides of the Atlantic. And this time when the war ends, the reversal is considerably less complete. Trousers for women, having now been normalized across two separate generations and two separate wars, never fully retreat from everyday wardrobes the way they had after the first conflict. By the 1950s, women wearing trousers and the pockets that came stitched into them as an unremarkable matter of course has become for the first time in roughly a century and a half something close to ordinary again. It is against this backdrop, a moment when practical women's pockets seem to be settling into place at last, that one of the more revealing quotes in this entire story arrives, spoken not by a reformer or a labourer, but by one of the most influential fashion designers of the post-war era. In 1954, the French designer Christian Dior, whose enormously influential post-war collections had already reintroduced highly structured nipped waist silhouettes that echoed in some ways the restrictive fashions of a much earlier century, is reported to have remarked that men have pockets to keep things in, while women have them for decoration. Whether Dior intended this as simple observation or as something closer to an unapologetic statement of fashion philosophy remains honestly a matter. Some biographers still debate, since the quote survives mainly through second-hand attribution rather than a fully documented primary source. But true or embellished, the line has endured for 70 years precisely because it captures something real, an entire design tradition, in which a woman's pocket, when included at all, existed to complete a silhouette rather than to genuinely hold anything of substance. That tradition remarkably persists far longer than most people realize, extending well past the post-war era into clothing being manufactured and sold today. In 2018, two writers working for a data journalism publication conducted a study that quietly confirmed in hard measurements rather than anecdote precisely what generations of women had long suspected simply from lived experience. Examining the front pockets on jeans, sold by the 20 most popular denim brands in the United States, the researchers found that women's pockets on average were roughly 48% shorter and around 6.5% narrower than the pockets found on equivalent men's jeans. Some of the pockets measured were barely large enough to hold a few coins, let alone the smartphone that by this point in history had become one of the most consistently carried objects in a modern daily life. The study circulated widely once published, striking a nerve precisely because it offered something the entire preceding century of complaint and observation had generally lacked: precise, undeniable numbers attached to specific brands that made an old familiar frustration suddenly concretely measurable. Why, one might reasonably wonder, would something as small as pocket depth persist as a genuine design choice? This deep into the 21st century, long after the legal and social barriers explored earlier, tonight had largely fallen away. The explanations offered by designers and industry analysts examining this question echo in striking ways the same tangled combination of forces we considered a little earlier this evening. Some point to simple aesthetic tradition. Deep pockets can disrupt the close-fitted silhouette. Many women's clothing lines are still designed around an echo, however faint, of the same tension between concealment and revealing fit that first eliminated women's pockets at the end of the 1700s. Others point again to commerce, noting that a woman without adequate pockets remains in purely economic terms a more reliable customer for handbags, an accessory category that continues generating substantial revenue for the same fashion industry that could, if it chose, simply build more functional pockets into the clothing itself. Neither explanation fully satisfies on its own, and scholars and design critics examining the question still genuinely disagree about how much weight each deserves, much as historians studying the original disappearance of the pocket 2 centuries earlier continue to disagree about the balance between accident, incentive, and quiet accumulated custom. What has changed, and changed in a way that feels genuinely new within this long story, is the tool now driving renewed pressure for reform. The smartphone, small enough to seem like it should fit anywhere, has become, for an enormous share of the population, one of the single most consistently carried objects of daily life, checked, constantly needed, instantly and simply too large, too essential, and too easily dropped or lost to be comfortably entrusted to a person down and momentarily forgotten on a train seat or a cafe table. Fashion journalists and design critics writing through the 2010s and 2020s have increasingly framed the pocket question explicitly around this device, arguing that a garment without a pocket large enough to hold a modern phone is, in a very practical sense, no longer fully functional clothing for contemporary life, regardless of how it happens to be marketed or sold. Some designers have begun responding quietly, reworking pocket dimensions in newer collections, though the shift, much like every previous reclaiming we have followed tonight, remains uneven, inconsistent across brands, and far from complete. There is something quietly poignant sitting here at the far end of this long story in recognizing how familiar this particular moment actually is. A practical need driven by an object nobody in earlier centuries could possibly have imagined running up against a stubborn inherited design tradition that has very little left to justify it beyond its own long persistence. It is in its essential shape the same tension the Rational Dress Society named in 1881, the same tension. The wartime factory worker felt reaching for tools in a coverall pocket her grandmother's generation never had the same tension further back still that a Victorian office clerk felt hurrying to catch a train with nowhere adequate to carry her fare. The specific object in the pocket keeps changing: coins, keys, a folded letter, a smartphone. The underlying question, whether a woman's clothing is designed to serve her daily life or simply to look a certain way while she moves through it, has proven remarkably durable across every single century we've travelled through together tonight. We are close now, close enough to feel the shape of where this long, quiet story has actually been leading all along, from a frozen mountainside and a small leather pouch through slits cut into crowded medieval streets, through a golden century of hidden equality through revolution and muslin, and a small mocked bag called a reticule, through courtrooms and crinolines and bicycles and 2 world wars, all the way to a pair of jeans measured quite precisely in a small newsroom in 2018. What remains as we let this long day of history finally settle is not another fact or another date, but something closer to what all of this has actually meant from the very beginning for the ordinary people who lived it. There is a museum drawer in London in a quiet upper room of the Victoria and Albert that most visitors walk past entirely because nothing about it announces itself the way a suit of armour or a jewelled crown does. Inside that drawer, carefully separated by sheets of acid-free tissue, rest a handful of 18th century pockets tied on with their original tape. The linen gone soft and pale with age. The embroidery on some of them still faintly visible if the light catches it correctly. Nobody knows the names of most of the women who wore them. Nobody knows what they carried inside on any particular morning. What small crisis or small joy passed through their hands on their way into that hidden fold of fabric. And yet here they are, still folded, still holding their shape after 200 years, waiting in the dark for someone to open the drawer and remember that they were ever worn at all. It feels somehow like the right place to end this long night together, not with a grand monument or a famous name, but with something this small, this ordinary, this easy to overlook, because that has been the real subject of everything we have followed since a frozen mountainside and a 5,000-year-old pouch tied to a dying man's belt. Not empires, not kings, not a single dramatic battle or a single dramatic decree. Just the plain quiet question of where a person is allowed to keep the things that matter to them, and who gets to answer that question and who does not. We watched that answer shift slowly, unevenly across 5,000 years of ordinary human need. We watched a hunter on a mountain solve it alone with leather and rope and whatever tools he judged worth keeping closest to his body in what may have been the final hours of his life. We watched medieval streets grow crowded enough to turn an open pouch into an invitation, and watched a narrow slit cut into a tunic quietly answer that danger, one small compromise stitched into the fabric of ordinary life. We watched for a century and a half something close to genuine equality flourish inside the deep-gathered folds of Renaissance dress, men and women alike carrying their private worlds hidden in nearly identical fashion, a brief window history rarely remembers to mention. And we watched that equality fracture quietly, not through any single villain or any single decree, but through the slow accumulating weight of fashion, commerce, and a hardening set of expectations about what a woman's body and a woman's clothing were actually for. We sat with a court record describing 11 shillings, a nutmeg grater, and a pair of scissors stolen from a woman whose name survives only because someone once slit the cord that held her pocket to her waist. We sat with a fashionable Parisian gown so thin and so revealing that it left quite literally nowhere left to hide anything at all, and we watched an entire private world reduced to a small drawstring bag that its own century mocked as ridiculous, most from the moment it appeared. We followed the long, patient argument of the Rational Dress Society, laughed at in its own time and largely vindicated by ours. We followed servants and clerks and cyclists, each finding their own quiet, practical way back towards something the fashionable world had decided 100 years earlier that women no longer needed. We followed 2 wars that asked women to build engines and drive ambulances, and never once asked how they were expected to do it without pockets, and so, almost as an afterthought, gave them back, and we followed all of it forward into a small newsroom in 2018, where 2 writers with a measuring tape confirmed in cold numbers what generations of women had already known simply by trying to fit a set of keys into a pocket built for almost nothing at all. What does a story like this actually tell us lying here at the end of it, in the dark with the whole shape of it finally visible behind us? Perhaps this, that history rarely announces its cruelties with trumpets. It tends far more often to arrive quietly stitched into something as unremarkable as a hemline, hidden inside a decision nobody quite remembers making worn every day by millions of people who never had the chance to ask why things were built the way they were. The disappearance of the woman's pocket was never a single dramatic event. It was thousands of small, private inconveniences repeated across 2 centuries, absorbed so completely into the ordinary texture of daily life that most of the women living through it simply learned to carry a bag instead, and rarely thought to ask what had been lost, because the loss itself had never been announced. That is perhaps the truest kind of brutality history offers us, not the kind that draws blood, but the kind that simply becomes normal generation after generation until normal is the only word left to describe it. And yet the story does not end in resignation, and it never really did, because alongside every quiet loss we have followed tonight sits an equally quiet act of resistance, so ordinary it rarely gets remembered as resistance at all. A servant sewing a sturdy pocket into her own apron because the fashionable alternative simply could not survive an honest day's work. A cyclist choosing a divided skirt over public ridicule because she had somewhere she actually needed to go. A woman in a wartime factory rolling up her sleeves and reaching without a second thought into a coverall pocket her grandmother would have found almost unimaginable. None of them were trying to make history. They were simply trying to get through their day with their hands free and their belongings closed, the same small human need that carried a man across a mountain pass 5,000 years before any of them were born. And it turns out that need, however quietly it gets dismissed by fashion, or by law, or by an entire century's worth of unexamined custom, has a way of eventually patiently finding its way back. That is the quieter pattern, sitting underneath this entire evening, and perhaps underneath a great deal of history that never makes it into the grander books at all. Power, even something as modest as the power to carry your own coin without depending on someone else to hold it for you, is far more fragile than it ever appears while it is being taken away. And ordinary people, given no dramatic tools at all, only the plain fact of their own daily needs, have an uncanny, patient way of taking it back one apron pocket, one bicycle skirt, one wartime coverall at a time. Somewhere tonight in a house not so different from wherever you happen to be listening from, a pair of jeans is folded over the back of a chair, its front pockets, if it happens to belong to a woman, very possibly still too shallow to hold the phone resting beside it on the nightstand. The specific argument has changed its shape again, as it always eventually does, coins giving way to keys, keys giving way to a small glowing rectangle. Nobody 5,000 years ago could have possibly imagined needing to carry. But underneath that argument, unchanged and strangely constant across every single century we have travelled through, tonight sits the same plain, unglamorous question a hunter on a mountain answered. Without a second thought, the same question a woman in a London court once answered under oath. The same question a cyclist answered by simply refusing to leave her tools behind. Where do I keep the things I cannot afford to lose? And who decided, however quietly, that I should have to ask? Let the mountain go quiet now. Let the crowded medieval street go still. Let the courtroom empty and the factory floor fall silent and the bicycle come finally gently to rest. Somewhere still in a drawer in London, a small piece of linen keeps its careful stitching folded the way its owner folded it 2 centuries ago, waiting patiently for no one in particular. It held so little in the end. A few coins, a key, a thimble perhaps, nothing the world would ever call important. And yet someone made it by hand. Someone embroidered it alone in the quiet hours of an evening much like this one, for an audience of exactly one person herself. Someone tied it around her waist each morning, without thinking twice, the way you might reach for your own keys without a second thought. Someone trusted it with whatever she could not afford to lose. That is all a pocket has ever really been. Not fashion, not fabric, just trust sewn quietly into cloth worn close against the body, carried forward by ordinary hands through 5,000 years of ordinary days. Somewhere it is still being carried. Sleep well.